Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time we're diving deep into the U.S. war in Afghanistan.
hmm
And for this one, we've got a really fascinating source. It's a podcast episode with
Okay.
with a retired colonel who actually served 2 tours in Afghanistan,
Wow,
and he really doesn't hold back.
that's great.
And I think that that's one of the things that makes this so valuable.
Absolutely. I think hearing from people who were there on the ground and experiencing it firsthand really challenges the official narratives that we so often hear.
Exactly. So we're going to be going way beyond the headlines today to try to understand why, despite, some early wins in Afghanistan, things ended up being so complicated and so difficult.
Yeah.
So get ready for a journey through shifting goals, cultural clashes, and the very tricky world of international alliances.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. I think one of the things that struck me is how clear the initial mission seemed back in 2001, right after 9/11.
Yeah.
The U.S. and its allies, they had global support to dismantle al-Qaeda, take away their safe haven, and remove the Taliban from power.
Yeah, and those early victories were pretty decisive, right? They
Eh,
really seem to be working.
Absolutely. They
Hmm.
very quickly pushed back.
Hmm.
The Taliban disrupted al-Qaeda. And I think at that point, many people, both within the U.S. and internationally,
Hmm.
believed that a quick resolution to the conflict might be possible.
Right.
But obviously, as we know now, it was anything but.
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting to me. You know, if those initial strikes were so successful, what happened? What changed?
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what we see is that the mission starts expanding beyond those initial goals of going after al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban.
Okay.
The U.S. shifts towards this much broader goal of nation building,
Oh, why?
aiming to create a stable, democratic Afghan government and rebuild the country's entire infrastructure.
So it went from like a targeted operation to something way more ambitious.
Yes.
Almost like trying to transplant an entire system onto a country with its own very long history and its own ways of doing things.
That's a great way to put it. And I think this is where the Colonel's experience that we're talking about today becomes so insightful.
Okay.
He talks about how the U.S. really underestimated the deep-rooted local loyalties and traditions within Afghan society.
Interesting.
For example, he describes how attempts to empower women in Afghanistan, while obviously well-intentioned,
Right.
sometimes backfired because they didn't fully consider the intricate tribal dynamics that were at play.
It makes you think, even with the best intentions, could the U.S. approach have been, I don't know, a little tone deaf to the realities on the ground?
That's one way to put it, yes.
Yeah.
There was often this disconnect between the Western ideals that were being promoted and the existing social fabric of Afghanistan.
Yeah. And wasn't corruption a huge problem, too? I remember that being a major talking point throughout the war.
Oh, absolutely. Corruption within the Afghan government was rampant,
Yeah.
and it really undermined everything the U.S. was trying to achieve.
Hmm.
The Colonel describes it at one point as trying to build a house on a foundation of sand.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Now add to this the whole Pakistan factor, and things get really tangled.
Right.
So what was Pakistan's role in all of this?
It was a complex one and a very controversial one. Officially, Pakistan was a partner in the war on terror, collaborating with the U.S.
Oh, okay.
But
But there were clearly some mixed loyalties at play, right?
exactly. And the Colonel reveals that elements within Pakistan, particularly its intelligence services,
Oh, wow.
were simultaneously providing safe havens and support to the Taliban.
Yeah.
Yes, they saw the Taliban as a way to maintain their influence in Afghanistan
Hmm.
and also as a way to counter India's regional power.
So it was a strategic play on their part, but one that created this massive obstacle for the U.S. Imagine trying to fight an enemy that has a safe haven right next door.
Yeah, it severely limited the U.S.'s ability to make any lasting progress because the Taliban could just regroup in Pakistan,
Right. Yeah.
launch attacks from there, and just erode any of the gains that had been made inside Afghanistan.
No wonder it felt like this constant push and pull, with no clear path to victory.
Precisely. And then on top of that, in 2009, you have President Obama authorizing a surge of U.S. troops into Afghanistan,
Right.
aiming to change the course of the war.
Didn't that surge have like specific objectives beyond just adding more troops?
Oh, absolutely. The goal was to deliver a decisive blow to the Taliban's secure key population centers
Okay.
and create space for the Afghan government to strengthen its institutions and gain legitimacy. It's a huge gamble with a lot riding on its success.
Did it work?
Well, In the short term, yes, the surge did achieve some security gains. They pushed the Taliban back,
Uh-huh.
improved security in certain areas. But the colonel really emphasizes that the surge failed to address the deeper systemic issues that were plaguing Afghanistan.
You mean the corruption, the lack of local buy-in, the disconnect we talked about?
Exactly. All of
Yeah.
those problems remained,
Oh, wow.
festering beneath the surface, even as the U.S. military was making these tactical gains.
Uh-huh.
So while the surge created this window of opportunity,
Yeah.
it was ultimately a missed opportunity.
Hmm. And it seems like this was made even worse by the fact that there were constantly changing strategies coming from Washington.
Yes.
You know, different administrations, different priorities, different approaches to the war. It must have been incredibly frustrating for the troops on the ground.
The colonel doesn't hold back on his criticism of the lack of strategic coherence from Washington.
Mm-hmm.
He describes it as a sense of whiplash,
Yeah.
as priorities shifted between counterterrorism, nation building, and then attempts at negotiation with the Taliban.
Yeah, it's no wonder there is this feeling of being stuck in this perpetual cycle, never quite gaining the upper hand.
Yeah, that feeling comes through very strongly in the colonel's recollections. And I think it really highlights just the immense challenges of waging a war in such a complex environment where military might alone is simply not enough.
Right.
You need something more than that
Yeah.
to achieve lasting success.
Yeah, it feels like we're seeing a pattern here, right? This attempt to kind of impose a solution from the outside without ever really fully grasping the complexities of Afghan society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a key takeaway from the colonel's account.
Yeah.
He argues that you can't win a war like this through military force alone.
Right.
You need a deep understanding of the local culture, the history, the politics to have any chance of success.
So it's about winning hearts and minds, not just, battles on the ground.
Precisely. It requires this long-term commitment
Yeah.
to building trust, working with local communities, not dictating to them.
Right.
And he emphasizes that this wasn't always the approach, especially in the early years of the war.
Which takes us back to the nation-building efforts. We've talked about the challenges, but were there any successes? Like, did the U.S. actually learn anything along the way?
There were moments of progress, particularly in areas like education and healthcare.
Okay.
The colonel talks about witnessing this surge in school enrollment,
Uh-huh.
particularly for girls,
Yeah.
and the establishment of new clinics and hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
So for a time, there was this sense of hope, a belief that things were moving in the right direction.
But that hope was fragile, right? Always overshadowed by this ongoing conflict and instability.
Yes, exactly. The security situation remained volatile, and the gains that were made were often reversible.
Hmm.
He describes it as this sense of 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
Right.
And he stresses that, the U.S. often lacked the patience that was needed for true sustainable progress.
Meaning they were too focused on, quick results.
Exactly. There was this constant pressure to show tangible achievements,
Right.
to demonstrate that the war effort was making a difference. And this often led to prioritizing short-term gains over long-term solutions.
So they were trying to force a transformation that simply couldn't happen overnight.
That's a good way to put it. Nation building, especially in a context like Afghanistan,
Yeah.
is a generational project.
Mm.
It requires sustained commitment, cultural sensitivity, and a willingness to adapt to unexpected challenges.
Which, according to the colonel, wasn't always the U.S.'s strong suit.
Yeah, he's quite critical of the lack of adaptability and flexibility in the U.S. approach.
Uh-huh.
He recounts instances where, well-intentioned projects failed because they didn't account for local customs or power dynamics.
All right.
And he argues that a more nuanced understanding of Afghan society was crucial, but often missing.
And this lack of understanding, coupled with the pressure for those quick wins, probably contributed to the strategic incoherence that we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. It created this situation where the U.S. was constantly reacting to events rather than driving them. And this led to, frequent shifts in strategy, which undermined the overall war effort and confused both the Afghan people and U.S. troops on the ground.
It's like trying to build a house without a blueprint. Constantly changing the design, adding new features without considering the foundation.
A very apt analogy, and ultimately this lack of a clear and consistent strategy, combined with all the other challenges we've discussed, really paved the way for that disastrous withdrawal.
The fall of Kabul, those chaotic scenes at the airport, they really became a symbol of the war's tragic ending.
Yeah, those images are seared into our collective memory. The colonel's voice cracks when he describes those final days.
Oh.
The desperation of the Afghan people trying to flee, the feeling of abandonment, the sense of a mission unfulfilled.
It must have felt like a betrayal,
Right.
both for the Afghans who had put their trust in the U.S. and for the soldiers who had sacrificed so much.
He describes it as a profound moral injury, a deep wound that goes beyond the physical and emotional toll of war.
It raises some really tough questions about the ethics of intervention. When is it right to get involved in another country's conflict? What responsibility do we have to the people that we're trying to help?
And the colonel doesn't shy away from these questions.
Okay.
He acknowledges that the initial intervention, was driven by a desire to prevent another 9/11 and to help the Afghan people.
Right.
But he also seems to be really wrestling with the unintended consequences,
Yeah.
the human cost, the ultimate failure to achieve lasting peace and stability.
Yeah.
He reflects on the hubris of believing that the U.S. could impose its will on such a complex and ancient society.
Yeah.
And he grapples with the fact that despite the best intentions, the war caused immense suffering and ultimately failed to achieve its stated goals.
It's a heavy burden to carry, especially for someone who's served on the front lines.
It is, and it's a burden that we all share to some extent as citizens of a nation that wields such immense power on the world stage.
Yeah.
And I think the Colonel's story is a reminder that we can't simply turn away from these uncomfortable truths. We have to confront them, learn from them, and strive to make more informed and ethical choices in the future.
His perspective is so powerful because it comes from this place of deep personal experience. He's not just reciting facts and figures, he's
Right.
sharing the human cost of war, the moral dilemmas, the weight of responsibility.
Exactly, and that's what makes his story so valuable.
Yeah.
It forces us to look beyond the headlines, beyond the political rhetoric,
Yeah.
and to really engage with the human realities of this conflict.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, and it's clear that the war in Afghanistan was about so much more than just, military objectives. It had ripple effects far beyond the battlefield.
The Colonel really drives this point home.
Yeah.
He talks about how interconnected the world is and how actions in one place can have consequences that, reach far beyond its borders.
So it wasn't just about Afghanistan's future. What happened there impacted the entire region and even the U.S.'s role in the world.
He specifically points to the rise of extremism and the displacement of millions of people
Right.
as direct consequences of the war.
Yeah.
And these are issues that continue to destabilize the region and have, global implications.
And what about the impact on the U.S. itself? I mean, we've touched on the financial costs, but there's more to it than that, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Colonel talks about how the war really stretched the U.S. military thin, leading to fatigue and strain within its ranks. It also eroded public trust in government institutions as the war dragged on with no clear victory in sight.
Yeah, the chaotic withdrawal from Kabul probably didn't help with that public perception either. Did it damage the U.S.'s image as, this global superpower?
It certainly raised questions about American credibility and competence.
Yeah.
The Colonel describes this sense of disillusionment both among allies who have supported the war effort
Right.
and within the U.S. military itself.
It's like the war shook the very foundation of American power and influence.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it.
Right.
He argues that it created a vacuum in this strategically vital region,
Right.
one that rivals like China and Russia are already trying to fill.
So the echoes of this war are still reverberating, shaping the geopolitical landscape in ways we may not fully understand yet. I mean, what does this all mean for the future of U.S. foreign policy? Do we need like a complete reset?
The Colonel believes that we need a fundamental shift in thinking.
Okay.
He advocates for a more humble approach, one that acknowledges the limits of American power and the need for greater cultural understanding.
Humility in foreign policy, that's not something you hear every day.
He argues that we need to move away from military intervention as the go-to solution
Okay.
and invest more in diplomacy development and building genuine partnerships based on mutual respect.
Yeah. It sounds like he's calling for a less reactive and a more thoughtful approach, one that takes the long view and prioritizes sustainable solutions.
Exactly. He stresses the need for patience,
Yeah.
for recognizing that lasting change takes time and can't be forced from the outside.
Right.
He also emphasizes the importance of listening to local voices and understanding their perspectives.
It's a lot to unpack, but his message is ultimately a hopeful one, isn't it?
It is. He believes that by learning from the mistakes of the past and embracing a more nuanced and ethical approach, the U.S. can still play a positive role in the world.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking, and I think the Colonel's insights really offer a valuable framework for moving forward. What are your final thoughts on this? What should our listener take away from all of this?
I think the most important takeaway is this recognition that our world is interconnected. What happens in one part of the globe affects us all.
Yeah.
And it's a call to be more informed, more engaged, and more thoughtful about the choices we make as individuals and as a nation.
And to recognize the human cost of war,
Yes.
to grapple with the ethical dilemmas, and to never forget the lessons learned. Thank you for guiding us through this complex and often heartbreaking story.
It was my privilege.
And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a new perspective on the war in Afghanistan and its lasting impact. Until next time, keep exploring and keep seeking knowledge.